HOA President Jessica believed she was making a power move by parking her car in my driveway. She thought she was blocking an old man's access to his garage, a simple act of intimidation to show me who was in charge of the neighborhood. What she didn't realize, as she'd soon learn in a federal courtroom, is that she hadn't just trespassed on private property. She had illegally obstructed access to a federally protected waterway, a mistake that would set in motion a chain of events leading to the complete dissolution of our HOA, over $1.2 million in combined fines and civil judgments, and her own personal and financial ruin. She saw me as Colonel Frank Miller, retired, a quiet widower who spent his days tending his late wife's rose garden. She had no way of knowing that for 30 years with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, my entire career was dedicated to writing and enforcing the very federal waterway regulations she was about to so brazenly violate. She picked a fight with the one man in the entire state who could not only quote the specific federal statutes she was breaking, but who also personally knew the people in charge of enforcing them. Her name was Jessica Martin, 42 years old, the self-appointed queen of the Parkview Meadows Homeowners Association. Before her reign, she'd been some kind of diamond-tier executive in a multi-level marketing company that sold essential oils, and she carried that same condescending energy into her role as HOA president. She had a perpetually forced smile, perfectly manicured nails that clicked on her clipboard during inspections, and a habit of calling everyone "hon" in a tone that made it sound like an insult. Her white sedan, the one currently occupying my driveway, still had a peeling "Boss Babe" sticker on the back window, a sad relic of her past career. In her mind, the HOA's Book of Covenants wasn't a set of guidelines for the community. It was her personal weapon, a tool to terrorize residents, feed her ego, and, as I would soon discover, line her own pockets. But you need to understand, this was never just about a car in my driveway. That was just the opening shot in her war, a poorly calculated move in a game she didn't understand. This was a battle for my home, the one my father, a structural engineer himself, built with his own hands back in 1962. It was a fight to protect the small, beautiful creek that runs behind my property, a protected natural habitat teeming with life. And ultimately, it became a campaign to dismantle a corrupt HOA that was systematically draining the life savings of my neighbors, one absurd fine and one act of intimidation at a time. Have you ever dealt with an HOA president who thought the rules didn't apply to them? Let me know your story in the comments below. You're going to want to watch this to the very end because I'm going to lay out the exact legal and technical blueprint I used to not only defeat her, but to make sure she could never victimize another homeowner again. To understand how we reached that point, you first have to understand the ground we were fighting on. My story, and the story of this property, didn't begin when the HOA was formed in the late 80s. It began much earlier. I graduated from West Point with a degree in civil engineering, a path my father had always hoped I'd take. From there, I joined the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. For the next 30 years, my life was about water. Not just looking at it, but managing it, redirecting it, and understanding the immense power it held, both in nature and in law. I wasn't a desk jockey, I was in the field. I managed massive infrastructure projects, from levee systems along the Mississippi River that protect entire cities from flooding, to the complex water resource management policies we had to draft in the chaotic aftermath of Hurricane Katrina. My specialty became something called jurisdictional delineation. That's a technical term for a very simple but critical job, determining exactly where private and state land ends and where federally protected lands and waterways begin. It was a job that required absolute precision, a deep understanding of survey maps, historical deeds, and a body of federal law so complex it could make a lawyer's head spin. That was my world. Precision, facts, and the unshakable authority of federal law. And in the middle of all that, there was this house, my anchor. My father bought the 2-acre plot of land in 1962. It was nothing but rolling hills and oak trees back then, with a clear, spring-fed creek cutting through the back. He saw the potential. As a structural engineer who'd spent his life designing bridges and commercial buildings, this house was to be his masterpiece, the one thing he built for himself. I still have the original blueprints, stored in a cardboard tube in my office. They're hand-drawn on vellum, the lines still sharp, my father's neat architectural lettering filling the margins. I also have the original master plat survey from that same year, signed in ink by the county surveyor. It's a beautiful document, detailing every contour of the land, every property line, every mature oak tree he designed the house around. He taught me how to read those maps as a boy. He even took me out and showed me the physical iron survey markers he'd driven into the ground himself, their locations marked with an X on the plat. This property isn't just a piece of real estate to me. It is a testament to my family's history, a legacy of professional integrity, and a place of deep personal significance. My late wife, Sarah, and I raised our 2 children here, the rose bushes that Jessica would later destroy. Sarah planted those with her own hands the year our daughter was born. Every corner of this property holds a memory. That 1962 Master Plat Survey is a critical piece of the story. It's a legal document, recorded with the county, that predates the very existence of the Parkview Meadows HOA by more than 2 decades. And on that map, plain as day, is the creek. Running parallel to it on either side is a dotted line, and within that space are the words, 25-foot riparian buffer zone, conservation easement, not to be disturbed. That wasn't just a suggestion. It was a legally binding covenant attached to the deed itself, designed to protect the waterway forever. Even after I retired, I kept my professional engineering license active. I still do some consulting work on federal projects, which requires me to maintain a security clearance. And over a 30-year career, you build a network. The heads of the regional EPA office and the USAC's regulatory division aren't just names on an org chart to me. They are former colleagues, men and women I served with, whose expertise I respect, and who, thankfully, respect mine. Jessica saw an old man. She had no idea she was threatening a living piece of history owned by an expert in the very field she was about to blunder into. Before Jessica's reign of terror began, I was just Frank, the quiet guy at the end of the cul-de-sac. My neighbors knew I had an engineering background, and they'd often come to me for advice. I helped the Garcia family, lovely people 2 doors down, design a French drain system in their backyard after their basement flooded for the 2nd time in a year. We spent a Saturday digging the trench together. I advised the Patels on a hairline crack in their foundation, showing them how to monitor it and what to look for, saving them a needless and expensive consultation. I was part of the fabric of this community. We were neighbors. We helped each other. That was the world I knew. But that world was about to change. Jessica had the HOA's flimsy bylaws, written by a cut-rate lawyer in 1995. I had the original master plat, county records, and 3 decades of federal engineering experience. She thought she was bringing a knife to a fistfight. She had no idea I had the full weight of the U.S. government on my side. And I was about to use it. Jessica Martin didn't just stumble into the role of HOA president. She conquered it. She moved into the neighborhood about 5 years ago and spent the first 2 observing. She identified the fault lines, the apathetic homeowners, the toothless board members. Then she launched her campaign. She went door to door with glossy brochures and a dazzling smile, making slick promises about protecting our investments and increasing property values. She won in a landslide. Once she had the presidency, she moved with military speed to consolidate her power. She appointed her friends to key positions, most notably the Architectural Review Committee, or ARC. This became her primary weapon. Within 6 months, she had pushed through a new rule that gave the ARC, which she personally chaired, the unilateral power to levy unlimited fines for violations without requiring a full board vote. She had effectively become the judge, jury, and executioner of Parkview Meadows. Her real estate business, Martin Premium Properties, was the true engine of her operation. The scheme was as simple as it was predatory. She would use the ARC to target a homeowner, often someone elderly or new to the neighborhood, with a barrage of violations for minor subjective infractions. Then, she would suggest that the best way to solve the problem and increase the home's value was a significant upgrade. A new roof, a full landscaping overhaul, a new driveway. And she always had a preferred vendor ready to do the work. Once the homeowner had sunk thousands, sometimes tens of thousands, of dollars into these forced upgrades, she would subtly pressure them to sell, positioning herself as the only agent who truly understood the neighborhood's standards. She'd get the listing, take her commission, and move on to the next target. The budget for landscaping and community improvements in our HOA had more than tripled under her leadership, and a quick look at the public records showed that all the major contracts went to the same 2 companies. It wasn't a poorly run HOA. It was a criminal enterprise hiding in plain sight. You have to hear the stories of the people she hurt to understand what we were truly up against. Take the Millers. Arthur and Carol Miller, a couple in their late 70s, living on a fixed pension. They'd lived in their home for 40 years. Jessica cited them for having unapproved mulch in their flower beds. Apparently, the pine bark they'd used for decades was no longer acceptable. Only shredded cedar, which cost 3 times as much, was permitted. They were fined $5,000. The notice said the fine would increase by $100 a day until the violation was corrected. The Millers were panicked. They didn't have that kind of money. That's when Jessica swooped in with a solution. A company called Evergreen Solutions LLC could do the work, and she could graciously waive the fine. The bill from Evergreen Solutions came to $3,000. The Millers later found out, after I started digging, that Evergreen Solutions was owned by Jessica's brother-in-law. Then there was the Chen family, a young couple with 2 small children. They had installed a beautiful, sturdy swing set in their backyard for their daughter's birthday. It was painted in bright, cheerful colors. Jessica cited them for violating a rule about natural color palettes. The Chens, both lawyers, tried to fight it. They argued the rule was vague and selectively enforced. In response, Jessica, using her ARC authority, had a lien placed on their home. Just like that, their property title was clouded. They couldn't refinance their mortgage to take advantage of lower interest rates. They couldn't get a home equity loan for a planned renovation. They were trapped. The stress became so immense that they eventually gave in, took down the swing, set, and painted their fence a drab, HOA-approved shade of beige. Jessica had crushed their spirit. These weren't isolated incidents. This was a pattern of systematic abuse. My own battle with her began subtly. The first notice was for my overgrown azalea bushes. I trimmed them. The next was a violation for my satellite dish being visible from the street. I calmly replied via certified mail, citing the federal OTARD rule, which prohibits HOAs from restricting satellite dish installation. The violation was rescinded without comment. I think that's when she realized I wasn't going to be an easy target like the Millers. That's when she turned her attention to her pet project, the Parkview Meadows Creekside Beautification Path. It was a proposed walking trail along the creek, a project she sold to the community as an amenity that would boost everyone's property values. What most people didn't know was that the path's primary purpose was to provide direct, scenic access to 2 vacant lots at the far end of the neighborhood. Vacant lots that she, under her business name, was the exclusive listing agent for. My property was the key. The geography of the land meant the easiest, cheapest place to start the path was through the back of my lot. When I formally refused to grant access, citing the pre-existing conservation easement, she decided to escalate. That's when she invented her masterpiece of suburban tyranny. She held a special meeting, which she announced with the bare minimum legal notice, and passed a new bylaw. It created an HOA utility and access easement over the first 15 feet of every resident's driveway. Her justification was for community maintenance and access to common areas. There was no common area accessible from my driveway. It was a rule created for one purpose: to give her the legal cover to do exactly what she wanted. 2 days later, for the first time, her white sedan was parked at the end of my driveway. She thought her invented bylaw could overwrite a 60-year-old property survey and federal law. She was about to learn a very expensive lesson in legal jurisdiction. My next stop wasn't the library to look up HOA rules. It was the county archives to pull the original deeds that would be the first nail in her coffin. A problem of this nature couldn't be solved with angry letters or shouting matches at HOA meetings. That was her arena, a world of subjective rules and personal attacks. My arena was different. It was the world of hard facts, verifiable data, and established law. So I went back to my training. I began a methodical, multi-pronged investigation. The first step was to re-verify every known fact about my own property. I didn't just trust my memory of the old documents. I treated it as a new mission. I retrieved my old surveying equipment from the workshop, a wild T2 theodolite, and a standard transit. These are instruments of precision, not something you find at the local hardware store. For the better part of a day, I conducted my own topographical survey of my property. I set up the transit, took my readings, and plotted the data points on a new topographical map, cross-referencing my measurements with the fixed iron markers my father had set 60 years prior. The narrative of the story for the audience isn't just me telling them I'm an expert, it's showing them the work of an expert. The process confirmed that the original 1962 plat was accurate to within a single centimeter. It also confirmed, without a shadow of a doubt, that my property line extended to the geographical center of the creek, and that the entire 25-foot conservation easement on my side was, in fact, my private property. The next step was to define the legal status of the creek itself. To Jessica, it was just a ditch. But in my world, there's no such thing. Every body of water falls under some jurisdiction. Based on my experience, I was fairly certain it qualified as a water of the United States. I spent an afternoon in the county's public records department pulling historical water flow data. The creek was spring-fed and flowed year-round into the larger Callaway River, which in turn was a tributary of an interstate waterway. That was the key. Under the Rivers and Harbors Act of 1899, and more critically, the Clean Water Act, specifically Section 404, that creek was a federally regulated, interstate navigable waterway. The term navigable in this context is a legal definition. It doesn't mean you can float a battleship down it. It means it falls under federal jurisdiction. This single fact made Jessica's beautification path not just a bad idea, but a potential federal crime. Any construction, any dredging, any filling within that waterway or its adjacent wetlands without a permit from the Army Corps of Engineers was strictly illegal. With my own data verified, I moved on to her supposed authority. I spent a full week at the County Hall of Records, patiently sifting through microfiche and dusty binders. I wanted to see the origin story of the Parkview Meadows HOA. I found it. The original Articles of Incorporation, filed in 1988. I read every word. And then I found the clause that would ultimately prove to be her undoing. Article 11, Section 3. It stated, in clear, unambiguous language, that the covenants and bylaws of the HOA were explicitly subordinate to all pre-existing easements and to all applicable county, state, and federal regulations. Her freshly minted driveway easement bylaw was legally void on arrival. It was an attempt to overwrite a superior legal document, my deed, which was forbidden by the HOA's own founding charter. I paid for certified copies of every single page. The clerk who helped me, a kind woman named Martha, said she'd never seen anyone so thorough. I told her that in my line of work, thoroughness saves lives. In this case, I was hoping it would just save my home. Now it was time to activate my network. This had to be handled delicately. I wasn't trying to pull strings. I was initiating an official inquiry based on credible evidence of a potential violation of federal law. My first call was to David Chen. David had been a young lieutenant under my command 20 years ago. Now he was the chief of the regulatory division for the regional USACE office. I explained the situation calmly and emailed him a secure, password-protected file containing the HOA's path proposal, my original 1962 plat, and my new topographical survey. He called me back within an hour. His tone was serious. "Colonel," he said, he still called me that, "this is a clear violation. They can't do this. The plans show construction directly within the ordinary high water mark. I'm opening an official inquiry and assigning an investigator. Do not grant them access to your property under any circumstances." My second call was to Dr. Anya Sharma at the regional EPA office. Anya was a brilliant biologist with whom I had worked on several wetland mitigation projects. I explained the situation from an environmental perspective. She asked a question that showed why she was so good at her job. "Frank, what's the soil composition like in the riparian zone?" I had anticipated this. I'd taken soil samples and had them analyzed. "It's a Gandy loam mix," I told her, "highly permeable, and it's the primary habitat for the four-toed salamander." There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. The four-toed salamander was on the state's protected species list. Disturbing its habitat was a serious offense under the Endangered Species Act. "Send me everything you have," she said. "I think we have a serious problem here." The final phase of my preparation was to consolidate everything into a single, comprehensive evidence file. My military training taught me the importance of documentation. I created what we used to call a murder board, a file so thorough, so well documented, that it left no room for doubt, no angle of attack. It contained certified copies of the 1962 plat and the original deeds, my new sworn and notarized topographical survey with detailed field notes, time-stamped, high-resolution photographs, and videos of Jessica's car blocking my driveway on 14 separate occasions, sworn, notarized affidavits from both the Miller and Chen families, detailing their own experiences of extortion and harassment by Jessica, and finally, printouts of my official correspondence with the USACE and EPA, confirming that a federal investigation was now pending. Jessica was preparing for a small-town HOA meeting. I was preparing for a federal case. She had her binder of petty violations. I had a file thick with surveys, deeds, and letters from two of the most powerful regulatory agencies in the United States. The confrontation was coming, but it wasn't going to be the one she expected. The first real confrontation happened at the monthly HOA meeting, held in the drab, fluorescent-lit community clubhouse. I went in not to argue, but to formally place my objections on the official record. When the floor was opened for new business, I stood and calmly presented the 1962 plat survey. I explained the pre-existing conservation easement and cited the clause in the HOA's own charter that made it subordinate to such easements. Jessica and her hand-picked board members looked at me with bored amusement. She let me finish, then gave a dismissive little laugh. "That old piece of paper doesn't mean anything, Frank," she said, tapping her freshly printed binder of new bylaws with a perfectly manicured finger. "This is what matters now." The board, without even looking at my document, voted to fine me $500 per day for failure to grant access to HOA common property, retroactive to the day she first parked in my driveway. It was a declaration of war. The next day, I decided to test the limits of her local influence. Her car was there again, a monument to her arrogance. I called the largest tow company in town. A driver arrived, a big guy with a weary look on his face. He got out, looked at my driveway, looked at the HOA sticker on Jessica's car, and just shook his head. "Sorry, pal," he said, not unkindly. "We have an exclusive contract with this HOA. She's on my do not tow list. Can't touch it." He got back in his truck and drove away. It was a small thing, but it was illuminating. She had co-opted local businesses. She had created a bubble of impunity around herself. This was no longer just about bylaws. She was corrupting the community's ecosystem. The escalation continued. The following morning, I was drinking my coffee when a white pickup truck from Apex Paving pulled up. Two men got out and began unloading surveying equipment. They walked onto my front lawn and started driving wooden stakes with bright orange ribbons into the ground, marking the proposed path. This was a direct, physical invasion of my property. I grabbed my phone, started recording, and walked outside. My demeanor was calm, my voice steady. In my experience, the person who remains calmest in a confrontation holds all the power. I informed the two men, politely but firmly, that they were trespassing on private property that was currently the subject of a federal inquiry. I told them that any disturbance to the ground could put their company in violation of the Clean Water Act. I recorded their faces, their truck's license plate, and the name on the side of the door. They looked at each other, suddenly very nervous. One of them made a frantic call to his boss. A few minutes later, they packed up their gear and left without another word. I had won the skirmish, but I knew Jessica would see it as a personal challenge. And I was right. But something else was happening. Something she didn't count on. My quiet defiance was having an effect. My neighbors were watching. Arthur Miller called me that evening, his voice stronger than I'd ever heard. He told me that, inspired by my stand, he and his wife had filed a formal dispute of their fines with the HOA's management company, and had also filed a complaint with the state's Consumer Protection Agency. The Chens sent an email to the entire neighborhood, detailing their story with the lien and questioning the legality of the board's actions. A small crack had appeared in Jessica's wall of fear, and it was starting to spread. A local news blogger, a young man who ran a small but tenacious site covering suburban politics, got an anonymous tip. I later found out it was from my daughter, a lawyer herself, about the potential for a big story on HOA corruption in Parkview Meadows. He started attending the meetings, quietly taking notes in the back. Jessica started to panic. For the first time, her absolute control was slipping. The resistance was growing, and the reporter was asking pointed questions she couldn't answer about her relationship with Evergreen Solutions. She saw me as the source of this rebellion, the one who had tipped the first domino. And in a desperate, vindictive act of intimidation, she made her fatal mistake. I had to go into the city for a consultation one afternoon. When I returned, I saw the Evergreen Solutions truck pulling away from my house. And then I saw my front yard, the rose bushes, my wife's rose bushes. They were gone. The entire bed had been torn out, leaving nothing but churned-up dirt and broken roots. Taped to my front door was a new violation notice. The fine was for $2,000 for failing to remove plants that violated a new, emergency-enacted prohibition on thorny vegetation. That was the moment the mission changed. It was no longer a strategic exercise in enforcing regulations. It was personal. She had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. She had taken something that had no monetary value, but was priceless to me. And in doing so, she had sealed her own fate. The final act began with an email from Jessica to the entire community. It was a notice for an emergency HOA meeting. The sole item on the agenda: to vote on authorizing the HOA's lawyer to begin foreclosure proceedings on my home for non-payment of over $30,000 in accumulated fines. This was her endgame: to take my home, crush the rebellion, and make an example of me that no one would ever forget. The night of the meeting, the community clubhouse was packed. The air was thick with tension. The news blogger was in the back, his laptop open. My neighbors, the Millers and the Chens and a dozen others were there, their faces a mixture of fear and defiance. Jessica stood at the front, flanked by her board. She looked smug, confident. She thought this was her moment of ultimate triumph. She launched into a 10-minute tirade, railing against insubordination and the threat to our community standards that I represented. She painted me as a stubborn old man who thought he was above the rules. As she finished her speech and called for a motion to vote, I stood up. My voice was quiet, but it cut through the room. "Jessica," I said, "you can stop right there." On that cue, the main doors of the clubhouse opened. 2 people walked in. They were dressed in professional but practical attire. Their jackets had official insignias on the sleeves. One read, EPA, Criminal Investigation Division. The other, U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, Regulatory Enforcement. They walked to the front of the room and stood on either side of me. I let the silence hang in the air for a moment, letting the reality of the situation sink into the faces of Jessica and her board. Then I addressed the room. "Everyone," I said, my voice carrying the tone of command I hadn't used in years. "This is Special Agent Davies from the Environmental Protection Agency, and this is Mr. Henderson from the Army Corps of Engineers. It appears our HOA's business has come to the attention of the federal government." I turned my gaze directly to Jessica. Her face had gone completely white, her smug expression replaced by one of pure, dawning horror. "You thought this was about your HOA rules," I said, my voice cold and precise. "You were wrong. This has always been a federal matter." The room was utterly silent. You could have heard a pin drop. Mr. Henderson from the Corps of Engineers unrolled a massive official survey map and taped it to the wall. It was a jurisdictional map of the entire region, and he used a laser pointer to highlight our small neighborhood, the creek, and the bright red cross-hatching that designated it as a federally protected waterway. In clear, simple terms, he explained to the horrified board members that the proposed path, the one Jessica had built her entire campaign against me on, was illegal. He explained that any construction, any grading, any unpermitted activity within that designated zone was a federal offense, carrying both civil and criminal penalties. Then, Special Agent Davies of the EPA stepped forward. He spoke about the Endangered Species Act and the protected salamanders whose habitat would have been destroyed. He explained that the fines for such a violation weren't a few $100s. They started at $50,000 per day. He then turned to the matter of my rose bushes. He explained that since the bushes were located within the protected riparian buffer zone, their destruction constituted the unlawful discharge of fill material and destruction of vegetation in a U.S. waterway. He announced that the EPA was recommending the maximum possible fine for that violation. My meticulous research, my weeks of preparation, had become the foundation of an overwhelming, unassailable federal case. The battle of opinions and personal attacks was over. We were now dealing in the hard currency of federal law. The official actions came swift and fast. Mr. Henderson served Jessica as president of the HOA with a formal cease and desist order for the Path Project. He then served her with a notice of violation, which had the immediate effect of freezing any and all landscaping and construction work in the entire HOA, pending a full jurisdictional review of all their common areas. Their power to alter the neighborhood was, in an instant, completely neutralized. Then, Special Agent Davies handed Jessica a federal subpoena. It demanded all of the HOA's financial records, all contracts with vendors, and all internal communications, emails, text messages, meeting minutes, going back 5 years. It specifically named Evergreen Solutions, LLC, and Apex Paving. He wasn't just investigating an environmental violation, he was launching a full-scale fraud investigation. While the federal agencies were dismantling her power structure, I launched my own counteroffensive. The next morning, my daughter, acting as my legal counsel, filed a massive civil lawsuit. It didn't just name the HOA as a defendant. We named Jessica Martin and every single board member who voted with her personally. We pierced the corporate veil, arguing that their actions constituted willful misconduct, gross negligence, and a conspiracy to deprive me of my property rights. The suit sought significant monetary damages for the destruction of the roses, which we had appraised by a specialist in heritage horticulture, as well as damages for harassment, slander, and the diminished value of my home due to the illegal and fraudulent lien she had attempted to place on it. The dam of silence and fear in the neighborhood broke. The local news blogger's story went live, and it was a bombshell. It detailed the Miller's story, the Chen's story, and my own confrontation, complete with quotes from the EPA and the Army Corps. The story was picked up by a major city news channel. The State Attorney General's office, seeing the federal criminal investigation and the public outcry, announced it was launching its own investigation into the HOA's financial dealings, looking for evidence of racketeering and consumer fraud. The financial consequences for Jessica were catastrophic. On our motion, a judge granted an emergency injunction that froze every single one of the HOA's bank accounts. All operations ceased. Paychecks for the management company bounced. Landscapers stopped showing up. The power they had wielded was built on the money they extracted from us. And overnight, that money was gone. The EPA levied its first fine, $350,000, assessed jointly against the HOA and Jessica Martin personally for the damage caused by the surveyors and the illegal destruction of vegetation in a protected zone. Within a week, the State Real Estate Board summarily suspended her license pending the outcome of the investigation. Her business, Martin Premium Properties, collapsed. Her world was ending, and it was all happening with the cold, relentless precision of a military operation. The final victory was not a single event, but a series of them, each one dismantling another piece of Jessica's fallen empire. The federal and state investigations uncovered a breathtaking level of systemic fraud. The kickback scheme was exposed. Jessica and her brother-in-law, the owner of Evergreen Solutions, were indicted by a federal grand jury on charges of conspiracy to commit wire fraud, money laundering, and multiple violations of the Clean Water Act. The evidence was so overwhelming that they never even made it to trial. They both took plea deals. The State Attorney General's office filed a motion to have the Parkview Meadows HOA charter permanently revoked on the grounds that it was operating as a criminal enterprise. The motion was granted. A court-appointed administrator was tasked with dissolving the corporation and liquidating its assets to pay the massive fines and the restitution owed to the residents. The first act of the administrator was to declare every fine and lien issued by Jessica's board null and void. The Millers received a check for their $3,000, plus interest. The lien on the Chen's home was cleared. The fear that had gripped our neighborhood for years was finally lifted. My own civil suit was settled out of court. The defendant's insurance company, faced with the mountain of evidence, chose to settle rather than face a jury. I was awarded a settlement of $400,000 for the damages to my property, the harassment I had endured, and the emotional distress caused by the destruction of my wife's roses. It was never about the money, but the size of the settlement was a validation, a final public acknowledgement of the wrong that had been done. I used a portion of that money to establish a new, voluntary neighborhood association. It has a small annual fee, and its only purpose is to fund community events, a summer barbecue, a Halloween parade for the kids, and to maintain a neighborhood watch. Its bylaws, which I helped draft with the Chens, contain multiple clauses explicitly forbidding the kind of regulatory overreach and financial malfeasance that Jessica had perfected. As for Jessica Martin, her downfall was absolute. She was convicted on all federal charges and sentenced to 18 months in a federal prison for white-collar criminals. Her home, the one she had been so proud of, was sold to help pay the staggering civil and federal penalties. The last I heard of her, after she was released, she was working at a call center, selling satellite TV packages. Stripped of her power, her money, and her status, she was just another anonymous voice in a cubicle. I sometimes see her old white sedan around town. It's dented now, the Boss Babe sticker long since peeled away, a fitting symbol of her collapsed legacy. It's been about a year now. The old HOA signs at the entrance to our neighborhood are gone. The community is peaceful, and people are friendlier than they've been in years. The creek behind my house is now marked with small, discreet signs that read, "Protected Waterway, U.S. Army Corps of Engineers." They are a quiet reminder of the laws that protect our shared natural resources. Last spring, I went to a specialty nursery and found a classic variety of rose called Peace. I bought a dozen bushes and planted them where my wife's old garden used to be. They're thriving. My victory wasn't just about a car in my driveway or a dispute over a walking path. It was about defending my home, protecting my wife's memory, saving my community from a predator, and upholding the laws that I dedicated my life to serving. It was a reminder that one person, armed with the right knowledge, a respect for the facts, and the courage to stand their ground, can dismantle a corrupt system. And as I sit on my porch and look out at this quiet, peaceful neighborhood, I know it was a fight worth fighting. For more upcoming HOA conflicts videos, subscribe to HOA Stories Global.